want to be sure of that. Just in case. I also want to say, first of all, a little announcement about next Saturday. If you are still not a member of this church and you'd like to be, next Saturday we're having a new members retreat, and so you're invited to be part of that. Get hold of Amadi right over here, and she'll connect you up with all the details. Yeah, let Bob know. All right. Also, looking at Mike over here, I want to say a couple of thank yous. You notice that he's alone today. That's because Mary is home, but did she do a magnificent job last week? Make sure Mary knows how much we appreciate her being here and doing that. Plus, as I do that, I also want you to think a week back, and when Stuart was here. And didn't he do wonderful? And thank you to him. I have great announcements about Stuart. If you see him, please tell him thank you for that week, but also tell him congratulations because he is the new youth director at St. Philip Henry Pittsburgh. So to kind of connect up with him, he actually starts next week, so I'm not sure when we'll see him again because he'll be busy with a bunch of younger people than you. And so just congratulate him if you get a chance. So I want to remind you of a face. I am awake. How many have been that at some point in your life? And I don't necessarily mean at breakfast. But at some other point of your life where you're there, you are awake, kind of, but you're still asleep. And we do that for a lot of different reasons. For 2 years, I was up in the eastern mountains of Arizona and came down through this, either the Salt River Canyon or off the rim, and came down to Payson and drove every single week those roads. And towards the end of those 2 years, I was amazed how I would sometimes go, oh, I'm this far? Because I would kind of go into that automatic mode and those are not good roads to do that on. Right? But don't you do that in your life in some way or another for whatever reason, the routine or the boredom of it, or just because you're competent at it, right? And you get to where you're just doing the stuff, but you're not really awake. You're not really aware of what's going on. And part of the hard part about that, especially when it comes to the spiritual life, is that in the spiritual life, everything shouts louder than the divine. Doesn't it? It's really easy to listen to a boss. Well, maybe not listen, but to hear. It's really easy to listen and hear all the stuff going on around us and to have it pull all our attention that way. But we have to take some time and make some effort sometimes and choose to hear the divine. Everything else seems more important, seems more immediate. And too often we go through life spiritually asleep. And we know that's true because we've seen each other do it. And we know how you're asleep, or how you're not paying attention, or how you're not aware. But do we know that about ourselves? On a regular basis, we hear how you're busy just talking about your subject, not really listening or communicating with me. But are we aware when we do it back? Or we just assume all that stuff, but we rest in our asleepness. And in worst cases, we reflect this dysfunction onto each other instead of truly hearing and communicating. And we do it in all kinds of ways. I watched a movie, which surprises you, I'm sure, called The Experimenter. It's a marvelous movie about a man named Stanley Milgram. He's played by Peter Sarsgaard. And you may not recognize that name, but most of you encountered what he did, the experiments he did, because they are virtually in every single Psych 101 textbook or in any beginning sociology textbook. For he did experiments looking at people and how we interact and the ways we essentially go to sleep. One of his experiments, he put somebody on a street corner in a city and he'd just have them look up. And then someone would record what would happen to the passerbys. And you can imagine, here's the passerby. Right? Nothing there, necessarily. But somehow, I just give in to what's going on. But his most famous experiment, he would bring in two people, and he'd set one of them in front of a machine, and the other would go in another room. And they'd show them a set of different things, and then they would ask questions, and if the person got the wrong answer, they'd push a button which would send an electric shock in the person in the other room. You remember that experiment? See that? And that other person in the other room, as they continued to give wrong answers, they would up the electrical amount. And the person in the other room would yell and scream, "Stop the experiment!" And the person would say, "Wait, I got to stop." And the control person would say, "No, you've got to finish the experiment." And the disturbing thing about the experiment is that almost 2/3, 65% of people would go all the way in that experiment, giving increasing amounts of voltage to the person on the other side of the wall, who was part of the experiment, by the way. They were in on it, and they were playing a tape recorder over there. And they would continue to up that electrical amount even after the person became silent, because they would become asleep in that moment. They would give in to the authority. And in some ways, this was done back in the 60s, and in some ways it was trying to answer the question of why would someone like Adolf Eichmann listen to Hitler? How would they excuse themselves? How would other people in Germany excuse themselves? How would we sometimes do that same thing? And it showed, we want to think that we wouldn't, but we very easily fall asleep into whatever we've been taught, that routine that we've been given, that authority. We give in. And his question was, when are you going to wake up, essentially? But that's what this season is about. That's why we come around to this season of the Christian year every single year. It's called Epiphany. And Epiphany is about waking up. It's about becoming aware once again. And we use that scripture from Isaiah, which the images are wonderful. It says, "Arise, shine, for your God has come." And how many of you sometimes are kind of in that mode where you say, "You can make me rise, but..." That shining is not always simple, because we often get caught in all that stuff. And so we slip into that experiment pattern, where suddenly we're being or doing something less than what we ought to, what we want to, what we know we're trying to do. But God says we shall be radiant. Don't you love that word? God calls us to somehow be radiant in this world. But to do that, we have to choose to see something which in the day-to-day milieu of everything that we are and everything that's around us is often unseen, often unheard, often, even if it's seen or heard, unrecognized. And the aim of the spiritual life is to help us to choose, to see, and be and do what we don't typically do. Spiritual life is not the simple life. the natural, perfect, everything that I do easiest life. It calls us to see and be something more than all of that. The Celestine Prophecy back in the 90s is a book that came out and began to help me to think differently than what I had thought before. And it's not because the story was a great story, it's because he pulled out a number of different insights that are basic to the spiritual life. Basic to what we have to do in order to truly see and follow this divine movement around us and within us. And his first insight was pretty basic. It's that you have to be aware. He said, the first insight is one of awakening and focuses on the mysterious coincidences that occur in each of our lives. Of course, for centuries we've been discounting such occurrences as pure chance and thus without meaning. But as we ponder the spiritual dimensions of our existence, opening our minds, we begin to experience phenomena that cannot be dismissed or pushed away. Awareness of something happening, sometimes something that is very small, but something that in that moment connects us together. Something that in some moment, some time, some event makes it so that we have for that split second sometimes just a bit of connection. Do we notice it? Do we see it? Do we grasp hold of it and share it, or does it flow right past us? And part of the spiritual life is about choosing to not let it flow past us, but to recognize and share. I don't see Ara's, but I'm glad Marge Hefty does. And often she will talk to me about something that she sees, and I love to listen to that. Because she sees something that's beyond my sight, that is unseen to me, but in her voice I begin to experience what it might be. And in the voices of many of you, I see more than what I see by myself. But it takes two things. It takes Marge sharing, and it takes me choosing to listen. And that's what we do here together, is we choose to provide a space where we can both share and listen. And we all have to have the courage and the patience sometimes to do that, because how many know that at least somebody in this room is going to share something that you don't quite understand or agree with or know how to follow? Yet in this space we choose to allow that sharing to happen because it's important that it does happen even if we don't see it yet. We also choose to provide that space so that we can learn how to hear beyond ourselves. Learn how to see more than what we see by ourselves. We choose to open ourselves up to that. Did you like our call to awareness? It says, look not with the mind, because my mind will often listen to what you say and go, but look from the soul. For the life that is coming is already before us. But we must choose to open ourselves up to hear it and see it. We have to choose that again and again. We have to, in the words of Redfield, find the eyes to see. And how do you see something that's unseen? You practice. You listen. You share and you hear what other people are saying. Redfield talked about two different ways. Two of his insights are about awareness, and the first one is about those coincidences that are there. But the second one is just as important. It is about the connections that lie between us. And how many very easily sometimes see the obstacles to that connection? How many have somebody in your life who they give you lots of reasons why you want to be further away from them? And he talks about, though, the energy that lies not just within us, but somehow flows between us. And that we have to become aware of how that is there, how that is possible, and how we can enter into that. And how it affects us in many different ways. And that takes an intentional connectedness. We have to have eyes to see not just the energy, but the value of the person containing that energy. We have to choose that again and again. Because I'm sure that person that we were talking about just a second ago, you have good reasons why you want to push them away. And sometimes it has to do with what it is that they're asking you to become. And you don't want to become it. But see, in that connectedness, we find ways to be able to both call them forward and let them call us forward. And if I don't have that connectedness, all we do is what? Fight with each other. But if I can, in that conversation, have a sense of connected to you, a larger than me view of us, then somehow I can hear you with different ears. But it takes that larger view, doesn't it? I have to see you not just as me and you, I have to see us as together in some way or another. And some of you, that's really easy to do with. I like who you are. And then there's some of you that challenge me a little more. And even more, there's some of them that challenge me even more. And yet, the promise is that God's there, right? And God's here. And that there's that connectedness between us. There's that energy that somehow is more than any of us. And the problem is, kind of like the beginning of our prayer today, that light, that energy will sometimes split you open. And how many aren't quite sure you want to have that happen? In the moment at least, right? In the moment that that person is challenging you, that is asking you to become, asking you to do, asking you to see something you haven't seen before, it's that light coming in trying to split you open, and you have to have courage to be able to hear and let that happen, because you will be glorious afterwards. It's just in the moment that it doesn't feel like it. A few weeks ago we had a brutal conversation. It was a great conversation. We had this room in a great big circle. More than 75 people sat in that circle. And we talked about the church and about what it could be and all that this community is trying to become, all it has been, all it is, all it will be. And we tried to hear each other, and it wasn't always simple, was it? Because there's all kinds of things that feel like we're lost. And Ellie, I think it was you who brought up a question about, what's going to happen? What is it that Jim's not kind of question, right? And I knew it was that kind of question. And so when George challenged you and said, give me an example, you kind of paused because I think you didn't want to hurt my feelings. I get that. And so I called out this kind of thing. I said, Jim doesn't say oneness. Anybody notice that? Yeah, Jim doesn't say oneness. And I know that's tough for some of you because you like that word, and I'm going to tell you why I don't say oneness. And Ed came up and recognized this. He said, you don't use oneness, but you use the word community. And I'm going to tell you why I don't use oneness, because if I said oneness, what it would mean for me is it would mean that I would sit with my God off in my corner somewhere and forget about the rest of you. Because I can agree with my God much easier than I can agree with you. And community means that I have to figure out how to let that Godness in me and around me also speak into you. And I have to figure out how to hear the Godness in you and see the Godness in you. And I have to figure out how, see, community will never be perfect. It will never be easily one in the sense of what I would want it to be. Community always draws me beyond myself. I don't always like that. I wish that you guys would all figure out and be like me. Think like me. Act like me. It would be simpler for me. But community is about more than me, isn't it? It's about us. And it's about that great Spirit that's drawing us into more than any one of us. And I want that challenge to go away, but that challenge is good for me. And it's good for me because, well, no, it's tough for me because I disagree with you. Or maybe a better word for that is I diverge from you. In that moment, we're going in different directions. And that divergence is not simple. A divergence is not simple for community. It splits us into parts of community. And the idea of who God is God draws us back, not to be one, but to be somehow together, to figure out beyond whatever is splitting us, figure out what it is that draws us into a wholeness. Whatever it is we may never agree with, God calls us into seeing what it is that is still connected with us. God is always in the business of drawing us together, of helping us see more than what we would ever see if we sat off in our own little closets. God is always in the business of helping us see larger than just your own vision, my own vision, our own vision, but to see the larger picture of what we can be. But we often have to make an effort in order to make that happen. That's what Epiphany is about. And didn't Mary do a great job last week talking to us about light and how that light comes in, and that light is sometimes challenging and struggling, and that makes us have to see more than what we sometimes want to see. But how faithful are you in choosing to see Spirit in the people around you? How is it that you're trying really hard to see Spirit in that person? How is it that you're allowing that energy of God's presence to be there even in that person who seems most distant from that energy? How is it that you're drawing together that community which often wants to diverge? That you're saying, no, let's stay together. Let's somehow speak to each other, share with each other, listen to each other. How is it that you're allowing that God presence to let you overcome those obstacles, those boundaries? How is it that you're communicating in a language that you both understand? But I don't know about you, I'm really good at saying the same thing over and over again, hoping you'll get it. And listening to you do the same thing to me. And it continues to split us. But what God does to us is tries to help us to say, how do I speak differently? So that somehow in that different language we begin to come to each other. And our hearts can reconnect in some way or another. We are not in this life merely by accident, says the Celestine prophecy. Playing out a meaningless drama. Our lives have a purpose, a sense of destiny. We seem to be guided by a mysterious providence. But we have to choose to continue to hear that providence, continue to see that providence, continue to be that providence for each other. Stanley Milgram did an interesting experiment where he told his students, I want you to go out and get on a bus. And I want you to figure out a song that you know that you can sing, every single word, and I want you to stand up and sing it in the middle of that bus. Right? I want you to sing with that voice, and I want you to sing there, and you're going to be at somebody else noting what's going on. That's part of our job, is to go out and sing what it is we know, be the light that we are, but then be that other person as well that's noting what's going on. and listening to how other people are joining in or not joining in. We have to be both the listener and the speaker. We have to somehow figure out how to see in every moment the voice of God in that moment. And here's what's going to happen. The reason I love that arise, shine scripture is because of the promise that's there. It says that nations will flow to you, and sons and daughters will be carried in. Why is it? Because we choose to open ourselves up to who they are and be changed by them, as well as shining our light out so they can be changed by us. We choose to see that energy between us. We choose to see something that we haven't seen and let it affect us. And we choose to be that light for them, not in a, you got to be this way or else, but in an invitational way that allows them to be there. One of my favorite songs comes from a group named R.E.M. Anybody know R.E.M.? And they sing this song that had the longest title in the world. It's the end of the world as we know it. Right? And they sing that line several times. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. And I feel fine. You see, we want to stop that end of the world. We don't want